Thank you all for joining today's roundtable titled The Environment in Electoral Politics. Today is a collaboration between Engagement, the online publication of the Anthropology and Environment Society, and Talking Politics, a virtual series organized jointly by the University of Chicago's Center for the Study of Communication in Society, the University of Colorado Boulder's Program in Culture, Language, and Social Practice, and Brown University's Department of Anthropology. We have a lot of folks as part of this presentation today, so we'll begin with introductions by each, then have 4 presentations by our speakers who have pieces that have been recently published on engagement, and then we'll move into a moderator and audience Q&A. So to start, my name is Sydney Giacalone. I am a doctoral candidate in the Department of Anthropology at Brown University. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a member of the Talking Politics organizing team, as well as a co-editor on engagement.
Hi, my name is Jiahui Li, and I'm a junior professor at the University of Bayreuth. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm also a co-editor of the Engagement online publication. My job here today is to be timekeeper, and I will also be paying attention to the Zoom Q&A. So for those of you joining us online, please post your questions there, and I will try my best to get to as many of them as possible. Welcome.
Okay, hi, I'm Eric Hirsch. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm an associate professor of environmental studies at Franklin and Marshall College.
Hi. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry, I was just trying to go in order. This is Sandy Smith-Nonini. I'm a research assistant professor at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and I used to be a journalist, so you might be able to tell from my presentation when we get to that.
Hi, I'm Suchismita Das. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an assistant professor at Ahmedabad University, India, and I work broadly on environmental issues through an anthropological lens.
Hi, I'm Chiara, and I'm a PhD candidate in anthropology at Harvard University.
Wonderful, thank you all. So before we begin with the presentations, I'm going to be giving a little bit of context for this roundtable. So in the fall of 2024, Engagement put out a call for posts asking how the environment emerges within ongoing electoral politics locally and globally. As we know, as an area of policy intervention, environmental politics is understood usually as things to do with water and air pollution, natural resource conservation, greenhouse gas emissions, and public lands management. Theorized more expansively, however, we feel that the environment itself is a concept under constant negotiation and renegotiation at local, state, national, and global levels. Voters, politicians, and private and public institutions determine the influx categories of policies that fall under the culturally constructed umbrella of environment. Whether that's in a given electoral conflicts of a school board nomination, a state representative runoff, or presidential election. Likewise, debates over legislation can be framed as focused on the environment while couched in underlying tensions around belonging, demographics, nationalism, and disputed truths. Electoral politics and their mobilization iteratively inform the way that the environment becomes understood as a sphere of governments, as well as a space to imagine alternative relationships with nature and the state. My own interest in this topic is informed by my current doctoral research on rural, multi-generational farmers in the American South and Midwest who have shifted from conventional practices to environmentally and socially reparative ag. Many of these stories begin with these farmers' growing conviction to repair degraded ecologies that they themselves have had a part in degrading. And I trace both this process of how efforts towards environmental remediation And these experiences have a way of snowballing into thinking about repair in social and political systems as a part of agriculture and rural America more broadly. In some cases, these farmers' environmental shifts have coincided with or even played a role in causing shifts in that person's political ideology and activism. These participants are increasingly passionate that making environmental change in American ag, what's often being called regenerative ag at this time, is a political topic that must engage with many of the most contested issues in our American political climate today. Contrasting them, however, other participants of mine are adamant that regenerative ag is a big tent topic that folks of many political ideologies can come find common ground in. And that even bringing up electoral politics as related to this topic of regenerative ag is divisive, irrelevant, or harmful to the environmentalist and community building aims of the larger conversation. In a very literal way, those I study are attempting to talk politics about the environment while navigating contexts that at times forbid talking politics. I highlight this example to begin our conversation by recognizing that the intersection of the environment and electoral politics in many of our research contexts and our own lived experiences around the globe are urgently important and in need of direct study. This roundtable and the ongoing engagement series seeks to address this through ethnographic reflections and experimental thought that study politics in practice to elaborate on the conceptual, methodological, and political affordances, tensions, and foreclosures that arise when examining environmental topics, environmental policy, or the environment as politicized within authors' particular field sites. And today we end my little spiel to start with about 10 minutes for each author. You'll notice that all of their pieces are live on engagement if you would like to read them in more detail after the fact. And as we said, the Q&A is open as presentations go throughout the remainder of the webinar. We will be starting with Eric.
All right. Well, thanks to everyone joining from around the world. Thanks so much to the organizers for bringing this group together. I'm really excited for the conversation. I want to give a shout out to some of my colleagues at Franklin and Marshall College, where two students, Noah Katzer and Carl Parkin, were super helpful in getting me to process some of this research over the last almost 2 years. So my post for the engagement blog Electoral Politics series is called Test Flight. And so I'm going to get to a few words on what that test flight was and what I think it means. But first, I want to start from a picture that I would argue most people on this webinar have seen, or it's somewhat familiar, the phenomenon that it documents. So this is President Mohammed Nasheed in scuba gear, as you can see, with the flag of the Maldives just behind him. And he's sitting as a member of this underwater cabinet meeting that happened in 2009 as part of activism by the Bill McKibben-led organization 350.org, right? He's signing a proclamation emphasizing the importance of fossil fuel emissions reduction, especially for the Maldives, right? Which has its highest natural point at just 2.5 meters above sea level. And would see serious risk of becoming uninhabitable, or as some media outlets have called it, drowning. This is disputable. That's another paper. So in other words, the framing in 2009 is that the Maldives could become basically destroyed as a coherent nation state if climate change is not dealt with immediately. But then, when I went back to the Maldives, I visited first in 2011, trying to look into how some of the climate politics are playing out there on the ground as this place is making itself known to the world in a really kind of splashy, viral way as this impending climate victim. Going back in 2023 and then speaking with some of its representatives at the UN Climate Conference in Bonn last year in 2024, suggested something else. And Sydney, if you could go to the next slide. So this is the capital city's main airport. And can you go to the next slide again? And this is a map of the airports in the Maldives, right? For a country that is whose exclusive economic zone is about the size of Maine, the US state, and whose land area is about the size of the US city of Charleston, this seems like it might be a lot of airports. So looking into this a little bit, from the context of the United States, our airport density is pretty high. I don't think that's something necessarily admirable, but so what we're seeing in the Maldives is not necessarily abnormal, but it is kind of unusual considering how close some of these airports are to each other, right? In this place where people had, for thousands of years, really become skilled fisher people and used boats for all kinds of transit between these islands, seeing all these airports, most of which have come up since that 2009 cabinet underwater cabinet meeting, is a little bit unusual, right? They kind of zooming in and seeing where that Kaluta-Fushi airport is, which I have the arrow pointing to. It's a bit like Lewis Black's note of a Starbucks across from a Starbucks, if anyone remembers that very old reference, right? It's just these airports like really close to one another. And can you go to the next slide, please? And so what is the meaning of all of these airports, right? I think that that part of what these airports are trying to do is articulate something that infrastructure elsewhere in the Maldives is also trying to do, right? That's one of the things that airports are doing, which is that the ocean is this unruly entity that needs to be guarded against. And so infrastructure enables and stages economic growth, connectivity, and possibility, even when some of the ecosystem formations would rather have a more flexible relationship, flexible boundaries between land and water. Next slide, please. In a lot of different ways, including through airports, an interesting phenomena I noticed and also saw many different Maldivian writers, intellectuals, and activists talking about is how the ocean has become this kind of new frontier for nation building, especially through the tool of land reclamation, essentially dredging up sand from the bottom of the ocean and drying it and creating basically new land, right? And so expanding the surface area of the country is in one way an effort to resist the victimhood of climate change and instead expand and sort of show to the world that this is indeed a growing nation that, that has control over the ocean. Next slide, please. So I detail that a lot more articulately in some of the post and some of my other writing. But one really interesting iteration of this statement of human infrastructure and human development as this attempt to conquer the ocean and show economic growth as this infrastructural phenomenon came in the 2018 re-election campaign of President Abdullah Yameen. Here he is after having lost that 2018 campaign, and he was attempting back in 2023 to get back into the race. He didn't end up being able to run ultimately, but here he is with this great like personalist billboard right on one of the main highways in the capital city, Mali, right? His behind him, he's this looking magnanimous and wearing a suit, and behind him the words say, "Hope lives." So one more slide for me, Cindy, and that's it for my slides. So there was this one airport in 2017 that a local council, but also a number of different environmental activists, including Humay Abdul Ghaffar, who writes this great blog called Divehi Saiti, sort of tried to push back against one airport that was really going in at the very last minute, right ahead of that 2018 re-election campaign. So I'm going to read two quick passages from my post where Yameen was making the case for this airport at a rally in Kuludufushi Island in 2017. And he noted that airports were, quote, the backbone of all economic work, and framed that island's traditional weaving and its mangrove wetland, which was part of that weaving economy, which the airport was going to be paving over. He framed that traditional labor as basically the work of a pre-modern society that must be discarded to make way for the future prosperity and connectivity and tourism that an airport promised, right? He's saying, I'm not talking about traditions and good customs that we have to throw away, but the things we do to move forward, to develop industries, to bring development to youth and the people. Do we always have to soak coconut husks? Why must we always soak coconut husks? So what he was doing here was taking this dignified traditional labor, mostly done and enacted by women on the island who made decent money from it, and it supported a fishing economy, and saying, no, that is the stuff of the past that needs to be cast off. Instead, airports bring prosperity. And what the airport actually brought was basically a debacle. So he opens the airport in 2018, and Humay Abdul Ghaffar, one of the activists I spoke with, recounted its opening. And I'm just going to quote her before I close. She says, there was no terminal when he inaugurates the airport. There was no fire and rescue. There was no ground handling. There was no nothing. He just went on a test flight and did his speech in the pouring rain because there was no terminal. But this is the level of sacrifice he was willing to make to get this done and tick this box to say, okay, now you have an airport. Doesn't matter if they could use it or not. There's the airport, here's the picture. That's the level of political delivery of promises here. And so it was really this like showing that a promise was being kept. And yet it also articulated this really kind of strongman style masculinist conquest of what was framed as a feminized nature, also associated with the past and with everything that economic growth was not. And so, the airport ultimately, to just finish the story, did not result in Yameen's re-election, but is something that folks on this island, even with another airport just 20 minutes by boat away, folks on this island now have to deal with this long-term, semi-irreversible infrastructure that has been paved over the mangrove ecosystem. So I'm going to close there for now, and I'm excited to talk more in a bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Next, we have Suchismita.
Hello, everyone, and echoing Eric, thanks to the wonderful organizers, and I've enjoyed reading everybody's work and looking forward to discussing it more. So in the interest of time, I'll just begin with what is it in my field, what kind of environmental phenomena led me to think a little more about how it intersects with electoral politics. And the phenomenon in question is a glacial lake outburst floods in the eastern Himalayas. As we know, glaciers melting, more high altitude lakes forming, which then get breached, leading to floods downstream. So this flood occurred on 3rd October 2023, and as scientists very recently have published this data, which said that on that night, about 50 million cubic meters of water came down. That's about 20,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Along with it, about 270 million cubic meters of sediment. Next slide. Next slide, please. So this caused a tremendous amount of destruction throughout the Tista River, and this is houses were destroyed. As you can see, boulders the size of buildings coming down the river, houses filled with silt up to 1 or 2 stories. The main highway collapsed on multiple places. 1200 megawatt dam collapsed, also came down the river. And so after this devastation, which is still continuing because people continue to live in relief camps and the infrastructure damage has yet not been repaired fully, in July 2024, the Indian finance minister, while presenting the annual budget, talked about Sikkim's devastation. Sikkim is the state in Northeast India, which borders Bhutan, Nepal, and Tibet. Sikkim has witnessed this flood, and we will, that is, the government will provide assistance to the state. So in response to that, if we can move to the next slide, my interlocutors who live downstream in Kalimpong, which is another, West Bengal is the state within India. So this river Tista, along which this glacial lake outburst flood occurred, as you can see, moves through 2 states in India and then goes into Bangladesh. So in Kalimpong, which is in the state, which was not mentioned during the budget, some of my interlocutors produced a video, which is linked in the post, where they highlight all the clips of devastation, submerged houses, people trying to write garden-say notes with "This is not Sikkim" plastered on it. And the question is, why is disaster relief being differently directed to 2 different states within India? And to understand that, we need to understand the elections, national elections, which occurred a month before this budget was presented in 2024. So if we move to the next slide, India has coalition forms of multi-party government, which means that if one party doesn't have a majority, it can form alliances and then a coalition government comes into power. So in 2024, this alliance of National Democratic Alliance came into power. The Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, was the leading sort of party in that. The problem was that it expected a lot many more seats in the parliament, and actually from the previous elections 5 years back, when BJP had 303 seats, it lost seats and was therefore more reliant on these smaller allies to continue to be in power, because if at any time allies pull out and they lose majority in the parliament, this leads to fresh elections in India. This has happened before. So one of the allies is the party in power in Sikkim, which is the Sikkim Krantikari Morcha, where I do most of my field work. It's a small state, only 1 MP in parliament. We could compare that to another state which has 12 MPs, allies in the parliament, and that state was promised 115 billion rupees for another flood which that state had experienced. And compared to that, so the people who made the video, they live in Kalimpong. This is a state which is ruled by an opposition party. So then the party itself, the opposition party itself, and my interlocutors frame this sort of environmental injustice as a form of electoral gift giving. And the money for votes question comes into this kind of moral sort of judgments about this phenomena. So in India, generally, political anthropology has been thinking about money for votes. And given that in elections, a lot of money is being spent, then the moral question is, does an election reflect the will of the people, or does it reflect the buying power of a candidate? So political anthropology kind of challenges some simplistic notions about this, highlighting that every time a candidate who spends the most amount of money doesn't win elections. And so the distinction is made between a gift, which is a normatively acceptable exchange, which creates a lasting relationship between a politician and citizens, and a shamefaced bribery of sorts. So if money spent on elections passes through this kind of moral normative frameworks, normative judgments, if we think about the video which my interlocutors produced as one kind of such moral judgment, then it's complicated. Their ability to offer a judgment is complicated by two things. One is that usually money, this kind of money for votes or handouts or cash payments are given by a politician to their citizens, to the voting public. This relationship through the gift is being cultivated between a regional government and the central government. So citizens in some ways are incidental to this relation building through gift giving. And the other is that this is an election which has just been concluded, so moral judgments will not lead to a fresh election or changes in sort of elected candidates. So if we move to the next slide now, a lot of the judgments have coalesced around this sort of technical sort of judgment of the lack of repair of the national highway. So the national highway over here is the sole highway which connects Sikkim and West Bengal to the rest of the country. So medicines, trade, tourism, etc. is dependent on it. And after the GLOF and continuing into today, this road is in high, states of disrepair. So citizens, if we move to the next slide, and we can play the videos. So one of the prominent forms of criticism has been this petition, which has been signed by citizens and sent to the Prime Minister, to other ministers, to local government officials, etc., which where the appeal is that there needs to be a mountain-sensitive policy, that there needs to be a unified Teesta Basin disaster management plan. So people have told me, and this is a quote, instead of this relentless playing of politics, why don't we think of this kind of repairing of the road and other forms of infrastructure by looking at this technical policy orientation, which will bring all parties together, which will bring bureaucrats together, and so on. So, and as I write in the paper, this is a form of technomoral politics where it is policy over politics, but it's not depoliticization. It's a way of engaging the state in a prudent manner, especially given that spaces for protesting the state all over the world are now under threat. So this is a kind of moral struggle for right and wrong, and not a struggle of right and left parties. And this draws on Boston and Sharma's work. So, and the title of the paper also comes from this kind of moral critique, which citizens of Kalimpong in West Bengal call themselves children of a lesser god. And in India, politicians are often seen as patrons. This almost becomes akin to a religious patron, who the local politician as lesser god is weak in being able to mediate necessary disaster relief into the state, into this region. So just to sum up, to conclude, so in India, in a political anthropology of South Asia, when we think of money in elections and environment, it is usually seen as a resource. So say a capitalist will pay a politician. If that politician is able to win votes, then they will give them mining, logging, concessions, etc. So environment as a resource in this money for vote scheme. So what I'm arguing here is that because climate extreme has been experienced in India, 5-fold increase in climate extremes in the last decade, 4-fold increase in extreme flood events. So if more and more citizens are suffering through these extreme weather and forms of disaster, then how disaster relief also passes through this churning of electoral politics, of this vote buying matrix, needs to be considered more closely. And generally, the world over, any strategic use of disaster relief to consolidate electoral power needs closer scrutiny.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And next we have Sandy.
Thank you. So Let me start this. I wrote a blog piece in Engagement about the exotic land of Texas, where I've been doing research on the 2021 Texas freeze. And it is a excerpt, if you will, in part from chapter 6 in a book that I'm writing called The Energy Permacrisis, which is almost done. And so that's the picture of our putative book cover. So next slide, please. I put in that box up the upper left, sort of the dilemma that we are in with, you see Trump kissing Musk's toes over here on the right, from the video that ran in the HUD building's TV monitor by accident. I'm sure it was an accident. But one thing that we are seeing right now is a threat to our existential life on Earth. And because there's a 50-50 chance the temperature will be over 1.5 degrees by 2030 consistently. Meanwhile, we have cuts to renewable subsidies threatened by Trump and Musk. And we've seen a doubling of electrical outages in recent years, just as we've also seen extreme weather. So, and the subtitle of my book, I use the term fossil debt. And in this blog piece, I used the notion of fossilized politics. And both of these, what I'm trying to describe in part is a kind of political rigidity that is accompanying, for example, Trump's current fossil-fueled coup, and also the existential risk that we find ourselves at. And at the same time, fossils also imply something something embedded. And I want to quote Susan Leigh-Starr for saying, "Surface the invisible work." And so what I've found is that there's a lot of invisible work behind the restructuring of utilities, which Texas illustrates. It has one of the about 18 states have market-based utilities. And so I'm going to talk about two things: the dangers of a corporate-driven free market utility system, and also why natural gas presents the real risk to us, not renewables, as Trump is implying. And so next slide, please. Thank you. So the Texas freeze happened in February of 2021. It was a polar vortex. There was a drop of 50 to 70 degrees below normal temperatures. And 4.5 to 10 million people lost power for 4 to 5 days. And a similar number lost water. The streets were icy, you couldn't drive. An estimated 700 people died, including excess mortality. Stores ran out of food. Ted Cruz headed off for Cancun. Governor Abbott went on Fox News to blame renewables. But the real culprit was gas. So if you could go to the next slide. This is Rakisha Murphy, who was one of the victims of the freeze. And importantly, she went almost five days, 4 nights without no heat in 6-degree weather. Her pipes burst. She couldn't use the toilet. Her son was paralyzed from the waist down. She lost her job. Her refrigerator rotted, but she was most worried about her son, who depended on machines to eat, and his feeding device didn't work. So many of the people at highest risk are exactly people like that, who have an ongoing illness, perhaps needing some insulin, perhaps needing an oxygen machine. At least in Puerto Rico, where I did previous research, many of the people who died were in that situation. Others simply froze to death in Texas, and or were killed by trying to heat their home in ways that were dangerous. Next slide, please. So what this whole investigation took me into was an unknown history, if you will, of US electricity deregulation, which most of us know very little about. But importantly, it was a period where the rules got rewritten for utilities. And basically, the old structure of a vertically integrated system was thrown out the window, partly because of the high debt from nuclear plants and the oil crisis of the 1970s, which shot rates up, and both things provoked a lot of public anger at politicians. Jimmy Carter wanted to get renewables off the ground. To do that, you needed reforms. And because there was this surge of free market ideologues in this moment, and the sense that under Reagan, that planning was an attack on freedom, market-based reforms won the day. And then there was a huge lobby of the oil and gas industry and utilities pushing for deregulation, and the states with high rates were all in favor, even though the Enron scandal put a bit of a hitch in that plan. But Texas went flying ahead, and natural gas, some environmental groups got on board trying to push for renewables, and natural gas prices were low. So, and it had just been deregulated. So we have this, you can go to the next slide. We have this coalition of folks who work behind closed doors to unbundle vertically integrated power plants, or anything public was encouraged to sell off if they wanted to be in on all these changes. And many states were planning to adopt these changes. So there were a lot of sell-offs for where states lost a lot of money in the process. Transmission and distribution, which were not profitable, were often left to the state to manage. There were opaque futures markets for energy, and this is what I want to talk about, that were at the center of these utilities. And this whole model, that was how you set prices, by bidding, and all of this was private. No public oversight of this futures market in the middle of the utility. And this was linked to conditionality for the World Bank and IMF. And so the new standard model for electricity now exists in 18 US states and over 100 countries. That model requires phase out of energy subsidies, which has caused new energy poverty in 3 of the places I've studied, and also in Nigeria and Ukraine most recently. Next slide, please. That's what the model looks like. This is the utilities exchange that's used to set prices. The regulators are not allowed into this system. And many of these new unbundled entities, such as the retail market, are very fragile, and they fell apart in Texas, and many went bankrupt in both Texas and in the UK, which has a similar market-based model. Next slide, please. Here are some of the quick problems really quickly. I mentioned some of these, but basically you don't have a real market. The incumbent utilities still have a lot of power, and the small retailers are very weak, and power plant, there's no rule that you have to serve the public, and Enron manipulation of prices is an illustration of what can go wrong. Next slide, please. So here's what I want to talk about. Until very recently, for the first 2 years after the freeze, this green box describes what we knew. And what the understanding was by all the studies was that poor weatherization had led the shale fields to freeze up their pipelines. They could no longer deliver gas supplies to the plants that needed to generate electricity. And so the power plants dependent on gas, which was half of them in the case of Texas, had to buy at very high prices on the spot market after the blackout, or sometimes from marked up prices from gas suppliers after the freeze began. So there were lots of lawsuits. There were hundreds of millions of dollars at stake. And Energy Transfer Partners, for example, is one of the defendants in many of these suits, and sued by San Antonio's utility. And of course, they are very wealthy and contributed, their CEO contributed to the governor's re-election campaign. But here's the interesting thing. There were some big winners on these energy markets. And there were, so usually it was the power plants that lost out, but the market speculation on these markets made bundles for the pipeline companies, especially the big ones, Energy Transfer and Kinder Morgan, but also there were paper traders, banks, and energy companies that made huge amounts of money. And this is all in the dark, and everyone wondered, wow, what was going on there? So that's where we stood. That was the knowledge up until the end of 2022. Next slide, please. I know I'm running out of time. I'll go quickly. There's a new lawsuit that came out in 2023, and basically, running off my timer here. This is a company run by an Enron trader. That's what makes this very interesting. Takes a thief to find one. He used his proprietary software to decipher the public metering data on pipeline flows all over Texas. And they're alleging, supposedly with a database behind them, which they've only revealed pieces of to the press, that companies curtailed gas flows using their access to gas storage facilities, and then used these critical notices to avoid delivery, saying, sorry, there's a storm, we don't have any gas. Everything froze up. And then they sold that gas at much higher spot market prices that they had stored. They also rerouted it from interstate to underregulated intrastate pipelines. So the lawsuit has invited hundreds of Texas citizens to participate. And so what they did was illegal because they were withholding supplies, if all of this holds true. Next slide, please. And all of this happened in advance of the drop in temperature, which is the red line here. So all the power plants were reporting shortages of gas. The Public Utility Commission knew about it. And here's where the withdrawals began to the gas storage facilities. So all of this happened in advance, and it's way beyond weather hedging. Next slide, and that's the last one. So it's interesting that right now there's a lot of scapegoating of renewables, and interestingly, it's turning out to be because renewables in Texas have been succeeding. And this is important because there's a lot of difficulty renewables face. If you are interested in it, there's a book called The Price is Wrong by Brett Christophers, which shows all of the hidden ways that utilities favor gas, and one of them is that they make money off the fuel itself because they pass the financing to customers. But what's happening now in Texas is that we're learning that wind success is actually threatening to gas. Renewables have outcompeting gas and oil and gas stocks also on Wall Street and by a number of studies. And this is a NextEra Energy CEO at the bottom, basically talking about how it's now very expensive to build a gas plant, 3 times more costs. It takes 5 years to get a turbine built, possibly because they're competing with Ukraine, and that gas plants have tripled relative to wind and solar. And so we're hearing a lot about this. So what we're finding out is that there's a threat.
Wrap up.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and I'm done. I just will stop there and suggest that we're beyond capitalism as usual. One of the ways to think about what's going on has to do with the threat to profit. And it illustrated very well in Texas. I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sandy.
Sorry about it going over.
No, this will be great for the discussion. And finally, we have Chiara.
Well, thank you to everyone, and especially to my fellow panelists and to the editorial and organizational work that the Talking Politics team has done. So I'm currently carrying out my field work for my dissertation, and I do my research in Polesine, which is a rural province in the Italian region of Veneto in northeastern Italy, which is predominantly a delta area where 2 of Italy's longest rivers meet the Adriatic Sea. And today I want to speak to you of crabs and their environmental politics, which is just a small part of my larger dissertation project, which looks at the entangled set of resource systems that compose deltic life. And I will largely be presenting the main points of my blog post that I wrote for engagement, and then sort of give some updates on where the situation stands since I wrote that article back in October of 2024. So my article was titled "The Unexpected Complication of a Crustacean Invasion," and it took as its starting point the arrival of a invasive, insatiable, and killer crab species, as it has been called in Italian newspaper headlines in the Northern Adriatic in the summer of 2023, which resulted in the economic devastation of many small to medium-sized bivalve aquaculture enterprises that dot the Adriatic coastline. And clam farmers in particular were the ones who were most effective, seeing about 96% of their production decrease in the years of 2023 and 2024. And alongside sort of the blue crab, the past 2 years have also seen the Delta become the epicenter of political pilgrimage, which residents have considered it as another invasion of sorts. So you've had parades of politicians who have come to visit clam farmers and promise financial support, emergency disaster funds, freeze farmers' mortgages, and most importantly, as we can see in this photo at a press conference, to pose with the blue crab. And here is the president, in the middle is the president of the Italian region of Veneto, Luca Zaia, and some of his colleagues. So what really interested me and sort of like motivated my blog post was sort of trying to wrap my head around the question of like why the blue crab invasion became such a viral and mediatized story in the Italian political and media landscape, and why it remains still today, nearly 2 years later. And secondly, why, despite such virality and supposed political attention that the blue crab and clam farmers were receiving, why in nearly 2 years little has materialized in terms of actual financial support and practical resolution for bivalve farmers. And part of my interest in grappling with these questions was sort of tied to the fact that for those of us like myself who work within the field of food production, the arrival of the blue crab is really sort of unexceptional in many ways. I feel like every month there's like a decimation of forms of intensive crop and animal production by different viral outbreaks. The current situation with H5N1 being, the most worrying and current one, and there's sort of a persistent presence of quote invasive species and pests as part of like the routine crises that sort of plague capitalist food systems. So one of the ways I would try to understand the virality of the crab for myself was trying to situate it within wider European agricultural and fishery policies. And particularly looking at the overriding narrative that politicians were giving as a way to resolve the crustacean crisis, which was basically, we can eat our way out of this mess by further integrating clam producers into the agro-industrial supply chain. Maybe Sydney, if you can go to the next slide. So the Minister of Agriculture, alongside business entrepreneurs, have really promoted the transition of clam production into the oyster sector, as oysters are less easily predated by the blue crab, mainly just from the way that they are cultivated, which is in baskets, which prevents the crab from piercing through the shell. And a couple of weeks ago, the Minister of Agriculture announced that he would reduce the VAT, which is the commodity tax on oysters, and treat them as an essential commodity to promote consumers buying oysters. And this announcement came alongside government officials, including the Prime Minister of Italy, slugging back oysters in Rome from bivalve producers in the Delta. And the event was sort of titled "Resistance to the Blue Crab." And here there's a meme that was published, I think, by the Democratic Party, which shows the Italian Prime Minister and the Minister of Agriculture, Lollobrigida, saying, "Oh, like, citizens are complaining of the rising cost of energy," and then the Minister of Agriculture is like, "But do we eat oysters raw?" And so really this was sort of getting at the fact that this announcement, which was supposed to be an act of gesture of good faith to producers, really was felt as a slap across the face for the vast majority of people who do not consider oysters a staple household good or source of protein. And really that oysters, due to their high prices, really remain a luxury and a niche commodity. And The second solution that has been provided in the past 2 years is basically the implementation of an exterminationist approach, which is essentially to overfish the blue crab till it reaches the point that it's unable to maintain its current reproduction and population levels. So in 2024, nearly 2,000 tons of blue crab were fished in the Delta, and about 80% of those crabs were not destined for human consumption, which means that they were instead designated as an animal byproduct under European law and incinerated. And so while more developed supply chains like meat production are already utilizing animal byproducts and subproducts to produce feeds and pet food or other non-edible products like biodegradable plastics, sort of the bivalve sector for now has sort of remained peripheral to these types of integration into large-scale industrial systems. However, the new government has sponsored projects and is inaugurating what will launch a blue crab rendering facility and to transform the crab into essentially fish meal and flour. And so what I would like to sort of stress is that while the political and agricultural sector responses have really focused on the animal and on the commodity and how to extract value from the animal in new ways, there's actually been very little focus on the actual people that are in this sector. And sort of this is the silent crisis of the blue crab, which is effectively a rural labor crisis, where you have 3,000 people that for 2 years have essentially been unemployed and have not received any sort of economic and financial benefits. And I think this sort of echoes, you know, the move within agriculture more broadly. So the new proposal for the Common Agricultural Policy, which is of the EU, sort of has really sidelined social and labor questions in its new draft. And I think one of the things that I find quite interesting about doing research in this region is that there's a straight through line from the extreme micropolitics of small rural town life straight to the Prime Minister of Italy. And what I mean by this is that everyone from like the mayor of the town where I live to the mayor of the province to the president of the prefecture to the president of the region and they're all far right Brothers of Italy party members. And so the failure of this political leadership and rule is really made clear in these moments of unresolved stagnating crisis where, you know, politicians in the town or anywhere, they really can't defer responsibility to the interference of other political parties. And also politicians have used clam farmers as sort of an icon of ideal, quote, Italian producers because clam farmers reflect, you know, their nativist fantasies of heteronormative, like white nuclear families laboring together. And I could say much more about this, but on the ground, clam farmers themselves like speak of the complete failure of what they call the institutional supply chain. So that basically all that they've seen is political talk, and it's all just been talk. So there's really a complete sense of incoherence in the approach to the blue crab, where once farmers in Europe are these highly privileged and a state-supported class of producers, yet at the same time, they're finding themselves to be these really marginalized and unsupported workers in the system that has purportedly been built to support and protect them. And really, we've seen the fragmentation in the last 2 years of the group of producers, and obviously the dispersal of clam farmers into other forms of work in the province. And I've mainly, you know, since I wrote this post, been following the labor trajectories of women who are a subgroup of clam farmers who in the highest numbers have decided to quit clam farming and give up their fishing licenses to seek alternative forms of ever more precarious labor. And many of them are working in fish processing factories, often in quite dangerous situations. You know, just as an example, one of the fish factories where I do my research burned to the ground in January during working hours, and many of the interlocutors that I work with barely made it out before the factory was completely engulfed in flames. And other women have turned to work as cleaners in the hospitality and service sectors to sort of subsist on scraping together an income through part-time contracts and unemployment benefits. So yeah, I think that's where I'll leave my presentation, and I look forward to the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you to you all for this rich conversation. We're going to now begin conversation both between the authors in a roundtable style as well as the Q&A. So folks, please continue to submit questions in the Q&A. And to start, I'd like to ask a question about your connecting points between the pieces. And I've loved that you guys have gotten to get to know each other's work a little bit with the posts before this conversation. So I'd like to start by asking each of you to speak to these connecting points in listening to each other today and reading each other's work. What through lines, connections, or broader takeaways on the topic of environment in electoral politics were illuminated for you? How does reading each of your work together, as opposed to on its own, open up your thinking on this topic? And anyone can begin, and I'd love to hear from each of you.
All right, I can start. Well, I think one, immediate connection that came to me is sort of the viral nature that certain images can have in environmental politics, and Eric's image of the Maldivian president underwater, I think, is one very clear example of that. And then I think another really useful connection that I found with Suchismista's presentation was sort of the relationship between vote buying and electoral gifts, and why politicians at certain periods present themselves, and sort of the disconnection that can exist between citizens and their supposed constituent representatives.
Thank you, Chiara. And people can call me Suchi. Yeah, I was thinking of a few connections, and especially one of the things in Eric's paper about infrastructure as sort of imagined as climate resilience. So that was something I've been thinking about. And so the dam which collapsed in my field site, the 1200 megawatt dam, now it will be rebuilt. That order sort of came last month. The 60 feet dam will now become 120 feet. So this idea that, climate vulnerability in some ways needs to be addressed by more infrastructure, more concrete, more robust sort of use of resources in some sort of techno-managerial approach to the environment becoming more and more precarious. That's something which I think resonates in a lot of the papers. And the other thing, Sandy, reading your paper, I've been thinking about the sort of market logics of utility production, because a lot of the vulnerability in this eastern Himalayan region, and there's a paper which says that now in these Himalayas across Nepal, India, there is a dam every 32 kilometers. And the other day in class, I was showing students something about this big company claiming greenness, and they're saying that they are using green energy henceforth. And a lot of that green energy is hydropower, and the cost of hydropower in these very different places and vulnerable places is something which needs to be considered. But then also, why do we build them, and who profits from them is something which needs more scrutiny. So, for example, this dam which collapsed was apparently the state was 32 billion in debt because of this dam, and it would not have recovered this debt till 2047 even if it continued producing electricity. So what are these logics of money, which I have not gotten into yet, but would be interesting and relevant to explore in environmental politics.
I think what your points are very important there, because we're looking both at the dams, the airports in the Maldives, the energy, the cost of energy in Italy, and the issues of farmers. All of these are connected up with money being diverted into infrastructure and creating debt. And that debt is more and more easily financed as a result of the policies, the rescue policies that followed 2008, which threw a lot of capital at corporations. The debt is not increasingly it's personalized, right? So the gas plants are easy to build because you can pass to ratepayers the debt. One of the quotes that I love comes from Michael Hudson, where he talks about the neo-rentier objective of reducing economies to debt dependency, and then you transfer public utilities into creditor hands, he writes, and then to create a rent-extracting toll booth economy. So when you get to an economy that is no longer able to produce, to earn enough profits from producing, you get a fictional economy that's based on this debt-based finance. And so it's much more, it's much easier for a politician to say, well, let's build this and let's build that, because he has private entrepreneurs, you know, on either side, or large firms who are willing to finance it and will have own shares in it and will profit from it. But it creates debt that then in the public will be passed to the public, and that's what's going on in Texas. So all those costs, which are in the hundreds of billions of the whole freeze, were socialized. Texas had to issue bonds, and ratepayers will be paying that for 10 years. But you saw the parties, the pipeline parties, that walked away with tens of billions in profits at the same time, because they could make their money in a hidden way behind closed doors.
Yeah, and to all that, I would just add that it seems like each of us are locating places where environmental vulnerability or some kind of shaky or precarious non-human form lends itself to openness and abstraction and basically being captured, right? We're following the ways ecosystems, species not being where they're supposed to be, separations not being maintained, how that becomes ripe for the seizing of a story, for defining what is really meant by this environmental change, right? Whether that's how disaster aid is unevenly distributed in Suchismita's case, or just in the stories that are being told about crustaceans and you know, power outages. And in Sandy's case, my memory of following that news story is that you know, Greg Abbott saying something to the effect of, "Look, everyone, this is AOC's America," when Donald Trump had like barely left the White House, and Greg Abbott himself was the governor and was the person in charge. And so I think just like the story, the like open canvas for telling stories and following what stories are getting bought and rejected has been really interesting to track across these different cases.
All right, thank you. I'm going to now move us into question and answer from the audience. So our first person to ask a question is Jane Murphy, and I'm going to summarize her question. She thanks everyone for wonderful presentations, and she wanted to know that whether or not, so all of us have been talking about and discussing the relationship between populations or communities and their elected representatives. And she wanted to know if perhaps there's a room for thinking also about activists and educators preparing and inoculating populations against more frequent future disasters. She's thinking particularly about Sandy's example of the lady who relied on machines and was affected during the Texas freeze, and also about Suchismita's example of flood. So are there efforts and ways to prepare people for disasters that go beyond the sort of electoral demands that are being made?
Quick
Yes,
point, did you guys see the news on France sending survival manuals to everyone? This is brand new news. I think because of the war situation, with
Yes.
them having to take on a leading role vis-a-vis Russia. And they sent everyone in the country a manual for how to stay alive, how to keep your family alive, how to think short-term and long-term.
Yeah, I think, and France isn't the only European country that's done this. I think, and there's another Scandinavian country that's recently sent out manuals for war preparation as well.
Right. So in my case, firstly, there is a very strong civil society which, I mean, advocates at least information about disaster questions like that. But again, a lot of this vulnerability right now, climate change, of course, but exacerbated by this sort of developmentalist imaginary, which is linked to big dams, big houses, etc. But a lot of this dam processes which have destabilized the place so much, broader highways. So then, how does one go beyond trying to solve this as a political issue? Because these are like big political decisions made about the direction of development, not that, and there has been local opposition to it. But in terms of preparedness, there's also, it's a very small state, very vulnerable state in these parts. So there's safety measures, etc. All of that can be discussed, but we cannot, and nobody can put the onus on surviving like something like a glacial lake outburst flood on any sort of very localized adaptation that is in some ways beyond the sort of technical possibility. So very briefly, I'll answer that.
Thanks. And because this actually follows directly onto Jane's question, so Abhijit Kumar wanted to also know if there were other kinds of associations or groups of people who were involved in these negotiations of environment and electoral politics. So he named examples such as labor associations, caste associations, women's associations, farmers associations, and student associations, and how they may be interconnected with environmental concerns. So I was wondering also, just to open it up a little bit more, in the Maldivian case or in the Italian case, were there other kinds of social groups involved in the negotiations of the clam farmers and the building of airports?
Yeah, I can answer that briefly. I mean, I think what's interesting about clam farmers specifically is their relationship to, I mean, in Italy, we have really strong institutional labor unions across the political spectrum. And I've been collaborating with one labor union, and one thing that I found really interesting is the sort of the hesitancy of wanting to actually have any association or being part of any sort of institutionalized support that could come from a labor union. So it's sort of like, what do you think you can do for me anyways? And I think this comes from the fact that of the specific thing that sort of clam farmers are individual like entrepreneurs. So they're their own business owners. So they're not employed in a form of contract or contractual labor. Which has obviously now changed when people enter, you know, a different type of labor that involves contracts. So yeah, I think there's a sort of a suspicion or wanting to not really be dependent on any sort of institutionalized form of aid or support.
Thanks. Yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
and also in my case, yes, there's civil society movements. There are activists who have come together under this sort of anti-dam movement. There are collaborations and long term since 2000. So this frontier opened up for hydropower in 2003 onwards, and since then, at least more than a decade, there has been a very active anti-dam protest movement over here. Which then, you know, how they are inability to influence large political decision making is something which is unfortunate. But there are a lot of organizations which do strongly advocate for environmental causes. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Sandy.
Sorry. I'm sorry, Eric. I just real quickly, another study that I did was in Greece during the period of the debt crisis, which I interpret also as an energy crisis. And you may have heard of Den Plirono, the anti-debt movement there, the I don't pay people, just picked up on in the UK more recently. It turned out an awful lot of their activism was around energy and around debt. So they're an anti-austerity organization, but when they looked around them, they found a tremendous amount of debt was tied to energy in various forms, both transport, heating your house, electricity. And they have turned out to be a very important advocacy. Currently, they're working on mortgage, people losing their mortgages. And so I just wanted to suggest that anti-debt advocacy can be very powerful because you find it everywhere around you causing the problems, and it's often tied with fossil fuels in some way or another. And I was impressed that in the UK in 2021, 2022, they picked up exactly on the Greek example.
Eric?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so there were definitely some airport protests that I heard and heard testimony about, and also have seen kind of as I've followed these infrastructural expansion issues from afar. You know, one of them was this hashtag Save Maldives, basically like advocacy group. I'm not sure if it's officially ranked as an NGO, but led by this interlocutor, Humay Abdul Ghafoor, who is helping to coordinate resistance and protest. There, you know, I think women members of the weaving community were speaking out at the time and since. There's a video that my post links to contrasting the previously thriving local economy with the minuscule, negligible economic contributions of the airport that sort of paint that in an interesting light. And I guess I just like one of the stories that I see in the Maldives, you know, with this particular case study, and also just as I'm getting more familiar with environmental justice conflicts and disputes in the US and around the world, is just that when politicians, policymakers, and corporations who are behind infrastructural expansion put their mind to it, they really can build and develop and move things quite fast, in some cases in the dead of night, even as other iterations of environmentalism are begging policies and building and construction, right, for housing, for instance, begging that to move forward. And, you know, it's just, you know, glacial and mired in regulations and disputes when, you know, depending on what interests are pushing in which direction. So I think, you know, the speed that Kuludufushi airport, that came with that airport, right, like in the last minute, right before the election, sort of showed where power was at that place at that moment.
Thanks. So I think this actually nicely ties into the next question from Noah Mizrahi. So Noah's asking, what kind of role do knowledge experts or scientific experts, those with scientific authority, play in situations like these? For example, educating the public about risks. How do these power dynamics work or relate? So what are the roles, or where are the scientific expertise in your cases?
Yeah, again, going back to the rebuilding of the dam. So it was given an environmental clearance recently, even when there is a strong sort of scientific backing to how there is this was not a thorough environmental clearance process, that this still takes account of older flood level modeling, does not take account of climate change and how rain is not the only factor which could cause floods, and therefore calculating the height of the dam and so on. So I think in India, but also generally, there is a strong within politics and anti-science sort of push, right? Like experts are not brought on board, or even if they are brought on board, they are not taken into sort of policy decision making considerations. Recently, I was attending a talk which was from a political scientist trying to highlight or ask the question why in Delhi, which is the most like air quality is one of the worst in the world, why does air quality not become a political issue? And their findings, and also in Sikkim, I see that it's not a lack of information. People do have technical knowledge about it, and there is also criticism. But then when does that kind of knowledge become election issue, in that it could influence which party is elected? And in India, nobody contests on environmental platforms mostly. So there might be one or two big sort of environmental conflicts which become election issues, but mostly, despite all of this, despite knowledge, election outcomes are determined by, in India, like caste, class, other kind of sort of considerations. So and that's an important question. Why does the environment not become like a voting sort of something which decides a vote? And it's not lack of information.
Yeah, I think I just picking up on that point, I think I want to echo that in the sense that this especially, it depends also what kind of information and what kind of approaches to dealing with environmental, disasters or things writ large. So for example, why do we deal with invasive pest management or in an exterminationist lens? Why, I mean, it's the same with the avian bird flu influenza. Why is mass culling or stamping out, as it's called, the approach that is considered scientifically the one to work? So obviously, there is a lot of, research and science that is produced that is offered and favored to that. So I'm surrounded by veterinarians and biologists and marine biologists all the time. So, they are quote experts, but I think it always, as anthropology teaches as well, there's different types of expertise and different types of scientific production that lend themselves in favor to supporting specific types of production systems. That in the case of mass epidemics or zoonotic epidemics and invasive animals species is really on the culling or exterminationist approach.
Sandy? Oh, sorry. Sandy.
No, I'll let Eric go this time. I'll go after Eric.
Okay. Yeah, I think, and I don't want to like represent a place too strongly, but just in my findings, kind of same deal, that like environmental science has not been taken up as like an acutely political problem that much, especially since President Nasheed's 2012 kind of precipitous fall and resignation, and I think one outcome of that is that like folks invested in mangrove and coral preservation and regeneration aren't really seen as much as political targets or people to be silenced, but on the other hand, some of their messages, are kind of associated as, just like articulating the wishes of an urban elite for other islanders elsewhere, as cities are like some of the in the Maldives are so invested in land reclamation activities and expansion in ways that hurt kind of the undersea environment. There's also an interesting recent conversation in some of the science, some of the geology of low-lying atoll coral island size, where sea level rise is not really necessarily correlated perfectly with islands going underwater, right? In a place where there's some, recent papers out in the last couple of years suggesting that where it's a coral atoll island that is not really developed by human infrastructure, they've noted expansion and islands kind of shifting around their place in the ocean or in their lagoons. And so that but like the extending that logically is that, well, yeah, it's great if you can leave islands alone, but humans also have to live and have to find ways of building a life. And how much is kind of not protecting coastlines really compatible with the types of lives that humans are able to live there. So there's a lot of interesting questions in the current debate as I've been learning about it.
So I couldn't help but think about the co-optation of science by highly theoretical neoclassical economists and rewriting utility regulatory language to be corporate driven. I think we have to contend with this issue of science, of the environment sort of being pushed to the side as long as the science, so-called science of the market and growth drives politics in so many places. It pushes everything else aside. And like for Suchismita, your comment about India pushing environmental issues to the side, environmental science, made me think of, well, that's because growth is really still working in India in a lot of ways. And so it's the religion instead of a religion that might incorporate people and animals in the wider ecology. But I do think that these things come in cycles, and there'll be a cycle where that can change rapidly. It's probably going to change in Texas within the next 5 to 6 years, because fossil fuel growth is facing up a lot of limitations right now. They're building right now demand, whether it's demand for growth or demand for profit, demand for electricity. Demand seems to command politics. Right now, though, they're defining energy demand around whatever is profitable in Texas and a lot of other places. So right now they're building a transmission system that will cost, I think, $70 billion or something along those lines in order to develop a new part of the Permian to keep fracking going for just a few more years. And so one of the things we really have to face is that, do we really want a predatory understanding of the future that's built around profit, or can we somehow wrest the notion of science back from the marketplace?
Thank you. And thank you everyone as well for all the wonderful questions. In the remaining time, I wanted to ask a question that maybe helps close this session and help us broaden up the discussion that we are all having today. So this question is very much informed by the current political situation that we are all experiencing everywhere in the world right now, and that's the rise of right-wing politics. And I was really struck, for example, by Chiara's piece, right, where she talks also about how the inclusion of the blue crab, right, by the right-wing party in Italy is very much also a politics of love, a politics of inclusion, even though the blue crab is a quote-unquote invasive species. So I wanted to use the last moment to let any of the panelists reflect on how right-wing politics is informing how people are thinking about the environment or contesting environmental politics in the cases that they're looking at.
So I think a reoccurring lament amongst farmers is, nothing is happening, that there's, too much bureaucracy. And, this is the Italian bureaucracy is the problem. But as we can see also in the US, this idea of like bureaucratization or streamlining bureaucratic systems to achieve better efficiency is also sort of like an extremely dangerous rhetoric. And a lot of, especially in Veneto, like the Northern League Party a couple of years ago actually ran on a de-bureaucracy platform. So I think while I think in Italy at least they've really jumped onto this idea that if we can get rid of bureaucracy, then we can allow unimpeded privatization and deregulation of social institutions into the public domain and utility. So I think this also touches on what Sandy, has been talking about. So I think there's like it's no surprise that like one of the touchstones of right-wing politics is really about, I think also a touchstone of the neoliberal agenda, which is not necessarily only linked to the far right. I think it's also something that institutional parties in Italy, such as the Democratic Party, have long sort of moved towards, and I think sort of now we're seeing sort of the ramifications of that process.
Yeah, just building on that a little bit. One of the things I'm tracking, and I'm pretty sure that this maps on similar enough where the Yamin's party, which is now in power again under somebody else, it maps with like aspects of the ascendant right wing. But yeah, just following how the gender politics are being worked through, and how kind of concrete and cement decimation of ecosystems that are wastelanded, right? Kind of dismissed as nothingness, as not providing an immediate growth value, are interpolated by this vision of masculinity. I mean, you see that certainly in the US last couple of weeks, fresh context. And yeah, so I'm trying to see like the gendered ways that environments and ecosystems are getting overdetermined and redefined, and maybe there is emergent ways that like folks on resisting unnecessary incursions and destruction are also summoning a like possible counter gender politics against right-wing expansion. I don't know, just some spec.
Thank you all. We are unfortunately out of time. I have so many thoughts as well, and this has been a really rich conversation. This is informing the conversations that I'm writing on right now about rural political alliances and unalliances, if you will, in regenerative ag. So this concludes our roundtable. I'd like to thank all of the presenting authors, the engagement co-editor team, the Talking Politics team, and our event sponsors. Please sign up for our upcoming Talking Politics events via our listserv. We have Talking Politics with Leah Sprain, Making Non-Answers Hearable on April 16th. We have a final colloquium coming up in late May, and the engagement series is also ongoing. So we have 3 additional pieces coming out for this series in the coming weeks. So please keep an eye out for those because I think they will really add to this conversation. And again, thank you all and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.